Hollywood loves to ban things it doesn't understand. In the 1970s, Westerns weren't just about cowboys and gunfights. They became gritty, weird, and sometimes brutally honest. And that honesty scared the censors. Whole films got yanked, edited, or quietly buried, not because of shocking crimes, but because they rattled the wrong nerves. So here's the question. How many classics slipped through your fingers just because someone got squeamish? Saddle up. These are the 15 forgotten Westerns banned for no reason. The Hired Hand, 1971. Peter Fonda could have coasted on Easy Rider glory, but instead he rode straight into a Western that Hollywood didn't want. The Hired Hand isn't your typical guns-blazing epic. It's slow, moody, and about something Westerns usually avoided. What happens when a drifter comes home after abandoning his family? Fonda not only starred, he directed, turning the frontier into a dreamscape of regret and lost time. Critics called it beautiful, audiences were split, and small-town theaters panicked. Why? Because it made cowboys look vulnerable instead of invincible. That alone was enough for censors in conservative areas to call it unpatriotic and ban it from local runs. What makes the film sting is its intimacy. Harry Collins, the drifter, wants to reconnect with his wife, played by Verna Bloom, who's moved on with her life. This wasn't a standard reunion. It was about a woman choosing independence over tradition, and that terrified the gatekeepers of the day. Add in Fonda's hazy, almost psychedelic cinematography and a tone closer to European art films than John Wayne, and you had a recipe for misunderstanding. The Hired Hand didn't survive its first run, buried under bad distribution and needless bans. But in hindsight, it's one of the most daring Westerns of the era. What should have been celebrated as a bold reinvention of the genre instead got tossed aside. Imagine outlawing a movie for daring to ask what happens after the ride into the sunset. That's exactly what happened here. Dirty Little Billy, 1972. Forget the polished legends of Billy the Kid. Dirty Little Billy dragged the myth through the mud, and censors couldn't handle it. Michael J. Pollard played Billy as a scrawny, foul-mouthed misfit stumbling into outlaw life almost by accident. The movie was grimy on purpose, shot in bleak, muddy settings with none of the Hollywood gloss. Instead of a folk hero, you got a punk kid surrounded by decay, desperation, and grit. It was honest, maybe too honest. Audiences expecting a heroic gunslinger were stunned, and critics split. But what killed it in some areas was the unwholesome tone. Theaters in Bible Belt towns outright banned it, claiming it was immoral and damaging to youth, all because the film refused to sugarcoat the outlaw myth. What makes this even more ironic is that Dirty Little Billy was years ahead of its time, closer to what revisionist Westerns would later embrace in the 90s. Director Stan Dragotti deliberately stripped the film of romance, giving us raw detail about poverty, boredom, and the ugly choices that led Billy into crime. It wasn't pretty, but it was real. And that honesty cost the film its chance. Today, it's a fascinating relic of a moment when Westerns were shifting from myth to reality. Too bad nervous censors thought that was too much truth for the big screen. Bad Company, 1972. How do you scare censors without showing anything shocking? You make a Western that feels like it was written by outlaws instead of studio bosses. Bad Company, directed by Robert Benton, followed two young men dodging the Civil War draft who drift into outlaw life. Sounds simple, but Benton injected counterculture energy into every frame. These weren't rugged Marlboro men. They were scrappy kids, distrustful of authority, and unafraid to mock the patriotic myths of America. Starring Jeff Bridges and Barry Brown, the film showed how survival in the West wasn't about honor, but about doing whatever it took not to starve. That rubbed conservative audiences raw in the early 70s. Some towns refused to show it, labeling it anti-American. School boards even restricted it from educational screenings, saying it glorified lawlessness. The truth? It simply exposed how brutal and unfair frontier life really was. Bad Company was beautifully shot, blending wide landscapes with an almost documentary realism. But its refusal to glorify patriotism during the Vietnam era made it radioactive. Ironically, The very thing that got it banned, its honesty, also makes it timeless now. Bridges delivered one of his early standout performances, and Benton's direction proved that westerns didn't need to rely on tired formulas. If anything, the bans proved the film's point. A society afraid of its own reflection will do anything to silence it. Bad Company wasn't corrupting youth. It was just telling the truth about them. Ulzana's Raid, 1972. Few westerns hit as hard as Ulzana's Raid, and that's exactly why some theaters refuse to touch it. Directed by Robert Aldrich, the film starred Burt Lancaster as a weary Army scout tracking an Apache raiding party. But this wasn't the noble cavalry versus natives story Hollywood usually churned out. Ulzana's Raid was brutal, complex, and unflinching about the cycle of violence on the frontier. The movie shocked audiences with its raw depictions of raids, ambushes, and the toll on both settlers and Native Americans. Aldrich didn't play sides. He showed everyone as trapped in a vicious cycle, with brutality answering brutality. In the middle of the Vietnam War, that message landed like a grenade. Military bases refused to screen it, claiming it was demoralizing, and some theaters pulled it entirely for being too violent. What makes Ulzana's Raid unforgettable is how it rejected simple heroes and villains. Lancaster's character respected the Apache even as he hunted them, and the film forced viewers to question whether anyone could claim moral high ground. It was as much about the cost of endless conflict as it was about frontier history. That nuance didn't sit well with censors who wanted clear lines between good guys and bad guys. Banning Ulzana's Raid didn't erase its power. It only proved how threatening honesty can be. Decades later, critics hail it as one of the sharpest and most unsettling westerns ever made. Imagine missing out on that because someone thought you couldn't handle the truth. The Culpeper Cattle Company, 1972. You want a western that looks like it was dragged through the dirt and left to dry in the sun? That's the Culpeper Cattle Co. And it made censors furious. Directed by Dick Richards, the film followed a teenage boy tagging along on a cattle drive, dreaming of adventure, but finding only mud, blood, and futility. Forget the sweeping John Ford landscapes. This one was shot in dusty, washed-out tones that made the West feel like a graveyard. Gary Grimes played the young dreamer, and his wide-eyed optimism gets crushed by betrayal, violence, and bitter reality. That honest portrayal of the West as grim and unforgiving sent some audiences into shock. Critics praised it, but in conservative towns, theaters banned it outright, calling it nihilistic and unfit for youth. All because it didn't pretend the frontier was a place of noble legends. The Culpeper Cattle Co. hit at a time when America was wrestling with Vietnam, Watergate, and cultural upheaval. People wanted escapism, not a film that rubbed their face in hopelessness. Yet that's exactly what makes it powerful today. The cattle drive becomes a metaphor for chasing empty dreams, and Richards never lets the audience off the hook. By banning it, censors tried to protect the cowboy myth. Instead, they buried one of the most honest westerns of the decade. The Culpeper Cattle Course didn't just strip the paint off the genre, it showed what lay rotting underneath. And that was too much truth for its own good. Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, 1973. Sam Peckinpah was no stranger to controversy, but with Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, the censors went overboard. This was supposed to be his masterpiece, a revisionist western about friendship, betrayal, and the slow death of the Old West. Starring James Coburn as Garrett and Chris Christopherson as Billy, with Bob Dylan floating in as a mysterious drifter and composer of the haunting soundtrack, it had everything. So why did theaters chop it down, and some towns outright refuse to screen it? Too violent, too bleak, and, most damning of all, too countercultural. Instead of another heroic shootout, Peckinpah gave audiences long, bloody ambushes, anti-heroes drowning in regret, and a story where no one really wins. The studio hacked it apart, releasing a butchered version that critics slammed. Even in its edited form, small-town theaters pulled it, claiming it glorified violence. That irony? The real cut restored years later, is more melancholy than bloody. The bands didn't just hurt Peckinpah, they buried one of the boldest takes on the Western myth. Dylan's Knockin' on Heaven's Door, born from this movie, outlived the film's troubled release. But the movie itself never got the recognition it deserved at the time. Censors thought they were protecting audiences from bad influence, but all they did was rob them of a classic that showed the West wasn't about heroes and villains. It was about the slow, inevitable fade of an entire way of life. Kid Blue, 1973. Dennis Hopper had already blown up Hollywood with Easy Rider, and Kid Blue was supposed to be his Western spin on counterculture rebellion. He played Bickford Wainer, a failed outlaw who tries to go straight, only to find the system is stacked against him. The movie was quirky, funny, and slyly political, definitely not your standard shoot-'em-up, and that's exactly what got it banned in parts of the country. Some theaters refused to show it, calling it subversive. Why? Because it mocked authority, made outlaws sympathetic, and dared to suggest the real villains might be society itself. Hopper's performance was manic brilliance, equal parts comedy and tragedy, and the supporting cast, including Warren Oates and Peter Boyle, turned the whole thing into a sharp satire of the American dream. But satire wasn't what 1973 audiences were looking for. Censors labeled it unfit for family viewing, and small-town exhibitors pulled it after a single week. That's right, an outlaw comedy was considered dangerous. In reality, it was ahead of its time, pulling the rug out from under cowboy myths decades before mainstream audiences were ready. Today, Kid Blue feels like a time capsule of early 70s paranoia, rebellion, and disillusionment. But back then, it was easier for censors to kill it than to let audiences decide for themselves. The Deadly Trackers, 1973. The Deadly Trackers is one of those westerns that feels like it came out of a fever dream. Starring Richard Harris as a sheriff, bent on revenge after outlaws destroy his family, the film is violent, relentless, and full of raw energy. But here's the twist. The movie was cobbled together from multiple directors after Sam Fuller walked away from the project, and that chaotic production only added to its jagged edge. When it finally hit screens, critics were divided. Some called it daring, others called it a mess. But what really sank it were bans in conservative towns, where theater owners refused to show it because of its brutality. Harris's quest for vengeance wasn't heroic. It was ugly, obsessive, and laced with moral ambiguity. That alone was enough to scare away censors who wanted neat, clean cowboy justice. Ironically, the film's unevenness actually makes it fascinating. Its rough edges give it an unpredictable, almost dangerous vibe, and Harris throws himself into the role with reckless abandon. But censors saw none of that. To them, it was too violent, too disturbing, and too different from the safe westerns they were used to peddling. The Deadly Trackers deserved a better fate than bans and bad reviews. It may not be perfect, but it's unforgettable, precisely because it refuses to play by the rules. Zachariah, 1971. How do you ban a Western? Make it a rock and roll acid trip, and watch the censors panic. Zachariah billed itself as the first electric Western, a psychedelic mashup of cowboys, guitars, and surreal comedy. The James Gang and Country Joe and the Fish provided live music. Don Johnson showed up in an early role, and the whole thing played like a Western beamed in from another planet. Censors didn't know what to do with it. Some towns outright banned it, saying the music and trippy visuals promoted bad values. Others cut screenings short when audiences treated it like a midnight concert instead of a movie. In reality, Zachariah was harmless. It was goofy, experimental fun. But because it blurred lines between genres, critics trashed it, and censors treated it like contraband. The film followed two friends who drift apart, one chasing outlaw fame, the other chasing spiritual enlightenment. Hardly dangerous stuff, but the psychedelic tone and blatant counterculture energy made gatekeepers nervous. Instead of letting it find an audience, they slapped it down. Today, Zachariah is a cult gem, remembered less as a Western than as a slice of early 70s experimental cinema. But at the time, it was treated like a threat, proof that sometimes the weirdest thing you can do in Hollywood is simply try something new. Welcome to Hard Times, 1970. Technically from 1967, Welcome to Hard Times got a second life in 1970 when studios tried to cash in on the wave of darker westerns. Starring Henry Fonda, it told the story of a town terrorized by a sadistic drifter, where cowardice and compromise proved just as deadly as bullets. Not exactly the stuff of wholesome Saturday matinees. When it returned to theaters, critics were more receptive than they'd been in '67, but local boards in some states weren't buying it. They banned it outright, claiming it was nihilistic and immoral. The problem wasn't gore, it was that the story suggested good men often do nothing, and that evil sometimes wins. For censors raised on John Wayne morality plays, that message was intolerable. Fonda gave a powerful performance as a weak mayor forced to face his failures, and Aldo Ray was terrifying as the villain who delights in wrecking the town. The bleakness was the point. The film stripped away the heroic fantasy and asked what people really do when confronted with violence. That honesty made it one of the boldest westerns of its time, and also one of the most unfairly punished. By banning it, censors robbed audiences of a story that dared to tell the truth. Sometimes the West wasn't about glory. It was about survival, compromise, and the price of fear. The Great Northfield, Minnesota Raid, 1972. Jesse James and Cole Younger had been Hollywood staples for decades, usually polished into larger-than-life legends. But Philip Kaufman's The Great Northfield, Minnesota Raid flipped the myth on its head. Instead of noble outlaws, it gave us cynical crooks, botching a real-life bank robbery in chaotic, almost comical fashion. Robert Duvall played Jesse James as unhinged and dangerous, far from the folk hero families in small towns had grown up worshipping. That was the problem. In some areas, especially in the Midwest, theaters refused to screen it. The outlaw legends were considered heritage, and this movie dared to say they were just desperate criminals who couldn't even pull off their most famous job. Bans popped up in certain towns, with exhibitors calling it disrespectful. Imagine that, censoring a film for daring to tell the truth. Kaufman's direction was sharp, blending violence with absurdity. The Northfield Raid itself, filmed in gritty detail, felt more like a disaster than a triumph, with civilians fighting back and the gang scrambling in chaos. Instead of glory, it was humiliation, and that honesty was more than some communities could handle. Today, the film stands as one of the earliest revisionist westerns to completely strip away the glamour from outlaw myths. By banning it, censors thought they were protecting Jesse James's image. All they really did was prove how fragile legends are when faced with reality. Cry for Me, Billy, 1972. Also released under the title Count Your Bullets, this forgotten western was one of the most controversial of the decade, not because of shocking spectacle, but because it refused to sanitize frontier cruelty. Directed by William A. Graham, it starred Cliff Potts as Billy, a loner who finds love with a Native American woman, played by Maria Potts. Their bond becomes the emotional center of the story, but the backdrop is relentless violence, including massacres of indigenous people portrayed with startling rawness. Censors hated it. Entire regions refused to show the film, calling it too graphic and unfit for audiences. In truth, the violence wasn't exaggerated, it was history, but showing it without a patriotic gloss was enough to get it buried. Unlike other westerns that turned Native characters into stereotypes, Cry for Me, Billy gave them humanity, and that alone was considered threatening. The bans destroyed any chance it had at commercial success, and the film sank into obscurity. Yet it deserves recognition for its bravery. It wasn't glorifying violence, it was condemning it. By showing the West as a place where prejudice and cruelty destroyed lives, it broke away from Hollywood tradition. That's why it's remembered now, quietly, as one of those westerns that went too far for its own time. It wasn't banned for gore, it was banned for honesty. Doc, 1971. When you think of Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday, you probably picture heroic lawmen gunning down villains at the OK Corral. But Doc, directed by Frank Perry, had no interest in feeding that legend. Stacy Keach played Doc Holliday as a sick, bitter man clinging to life, while Harris Yulin's Wyatt Earp was portrayed as manipulative and self-serving. Even Faye Dunaway's Kate Elder, usually sidelined in retellings, took center stage as a sharp, complex character. The result? A Western that stripped away the myth and showed Tombstone as a place of corruption and moral rot. Censors didn't like it one bit. Some small towns outright banned the movie, saying it dishonored American legends. Others cut screenings short when audiences walked out, shocked by how unromantic it all was. What made Doc so radical was its insistence on realism. The gunfight at the OK Corral, usually depicted as a clean showdown, was here shown as a messy, brutal shootout with no winners. Instead of noble heroes, the audience got flawed people trying to survive. That honesty was enough to get it buried. Doc deserved better. Perry's direction was sharp, Dunaway was magnetic, and Keach gave one of the most interesting takes on Holliday ever filmed. But censors couldn't accept a world where Wyatt Earp wasn't a shining hero. And so, they made sure fewer people saw it. Barquero, 1970. Lee Van Cleef was already a spaghetti Western icon, but Barquero brought him back stateside in a story that leaned into chaos and shifting loyalties. He played Travis, a ferryman who becomes the only thing standing between a ruthless outlaw gang and their escape across the river. Warren Oates played the villain with manic energy, and the entire film revolved around one tense standoff. So what got it banned in parts of the South? Believe it or not, it's racially progressive themes. The film portrayed Mexican and Native characters as equals, and it didn't shy away from showing prejudice as a form of cowardice. In certain towns, exhibitors flat out refused to show it, claiming it disrupted social values. Others banned it because of its harsh violence, though compared to later westerns, it was tame. Barquero is fascinating because it plays like a proto-Tarantino standoff, with characters scheming, betraying, and bargaining across the river. Van Cleef's ferryman isn't a classic hero. He's just determined to keep his territory, no matter what. And Oates, he makes villainy almost magnetic. The bans meant Barquero never reached the audience it should have. But looking back, it's clear the real reason it was targeted wasn't the gunfire. It was the fact it dared to challenge racial stereotypes in a genre that often reinforced them. That was too bold for 1970 censors, so they buried it. The Hunting Party, 1971. If you want a Western that shows just how far studios were pushing the envelope in the 70s, look no further than The Hunting Party. Starring Gene Hackman, Candice Bergen, and Oliver Reed, it told the story of a wealthy land baron who leads a hunting expedition, not for animals, but for the outlaw who kidnapped his wife. It was violent, relentless, and deeply cynical, painting the West as a playground for cruelty. That tone was more than enough to get it banned in multiple countries, and restricted in the U.S. Exhibitors claimed it was too disturbing for audiences, even though by today's standards, it's no worse than countless thrillers. What really scared people was its refusal to give audiences heroes. Hackman's character is ruthless, Reed is terrifying as the outlaw, and Bergen is caught between two forces of destruction. No romance, no redemption. Just a grim meditation on power and corruption. The Hunting Party shocked critics, bombed at the box office, and got pulled in several territories. But over time, it's developed a cult following for its boldness. Instead of offering a sanitized version of the West, it forced viewers to sit with the ugliness of greed and obsession. That's what got it banned. Not gore, not scandal. Just the truth that sometimes the frontier wasn't a place of honor. It was a place of nightmares. So there you have it, 15 Westerns from the 1970s that didn't get banned for gore or crime, but for rattling nerves, poking myths, or just daring to tell the truth. Hollywood buried them, small towns rejected them, and censors overreacted. But that doesn't mean you should. Which one surprised you the most? Drop your pick in the comments, hit subscribe for more forgotten gems, and share this with someone who still thinks Westerns are all the same.